Now, the crisis in Iraq has suddenly breathed new life into one of the great issues of British domestic politics. Just how much do you dislike Tony Blair? He claims that the invasion of Iraq, which he so vehemently supported, and so much of the country so vehemently didn't support, has nothing to do with the upsurge of violence there. Instead, it's the consequence of not intervening in Syria. He must be unhinged, says the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson. Even members of his own party accuse Tony Blair of acting like a neocon. Here's Emily Maitlis again.
Prime Minister, performer, statesman. Tony Blair united the left and swept to power on a platform of improving public services and a booming economy. And yet, it's a single decision for which most will remember him.
All we are asking for in this second resolution is the clear ultimatum that if Saddam carries on not cooperating, then force should be used.
Even as the death toll mounted, Blair stood by his decision. The apology which so many people want over Iraq has never been forthcoming. This weekend, we had a fresh reminder of how unlikely that is.
Even if you left Saddam in place in 2003, you would have still had a major problem in Iraq. Indeed, you can see what happens when you leave the dictator in place, as has happened with Assad now. The problems don't go away.
London Mayor Boris Johnson had a different take.
If you say seriously that the invasion of 2003 had absolutely nothing to do with the lawlessness and chaos that then took place, then I think you need your head examined.
And yet, when asked in a poll this weekend which leader would most likely make you vote Labour, twice as many people said Tony Blair as did Ed Miliband. So how did the British public view this man that they once embraced?
Well, PollyToynbee, columnist for The Guardian and author of The Verdict, Did Labour Change Britain? And David Aaronovitch, Times columnist and a proponent of intervention in Iraq, both in 2003 and now, are both here. Is it Iraq that makes Tony Blair such a powerful figure?
I don't really mean by powerful.
I mean, he excites powerful responses.
He certainly does, absolutely. Passionate responses. I think that an overwhelming number of people think that he was desperately wrong about Iraq. Some people think he's a war criminal. I don't take that view. I think he was disastrously wrong, and I think he has had to justify himself and that dreadful decision ever since. And I think it must be very hard to live with. And he can't leave it alone. He can't just be quiet about it. He has to persuade himself, I think, that all those people didn't die in vain, that the country hasn't been in turmoil for all these years for no reason.
It is Iraq, isn't it?
I don't know whether it's... Iraq is obviously a big part of it, but knowing I was coming on this programme, and look back at some of the things that I was writing before the Iraq War about what I described as Blair hatred, there was amongst a kind of section of opinion, usually kind of writers and other sort of people like this, artists, a feeling that Blair was an utterly fraudulent character who had destroyed somehow something important about the way in which politics in Britain worked, had diminished it down to kind of focus. You remember all this stuff about focus groups and so on, had essentially given way to a sub-Thatcherite agenda. That's if you were against Thatcher. And then also there were forces on the right, take the Daily Mail, which in 2010 did this editorial. You remember when Blair did his autobiography and gave £5 million to armed services charities. They said I think they said for once in his lying, warmongering, money-grubbing career as the former Prime Minister has done something right. Now, that level of hatred is not just about Iraq, it's about something other, and I think actually it's partially about Tony Blair, accept the terrible phrase please, as a change agent. Tony Blair is also associated with a level of change in this country which a lot of people actually found discombobulating and difficult, and they associate it with him, and there are also, frankly, aspects of his character they don't like either.
You mean because he achieved significant difference in this country?
I think because the country changed such a lot while he was Prime Minister, actually. And he stands in, actually, in a funny kind of way, in the same way as Polly and I do, in a much more diminished way, as being the sorts of people who have brought immigrants in large numbers to this country, as the sort of people who like the European Union, as the sort of people who would have given us over to the Euro, as the sort of people, etc., etc. You kind of get with the metropolitan elite, and he was the representative of it.
I think that's partly true, and of course we do have an 80% right-wing press who absolutely detest anything that Labour does and wish to trash his record. I think what's interesting about him, though, and why there is quite so much hatred, is he has been such a bad custodian of his own reputation. For two reasons. First of all, he spends his whole time on foreign policy, which was his weakest, most catastrophic point. He has spent very little time talking about the very good things that he did. The definitive survey of his social policies came out, produced by the LSE last year, just looking at how much he improved education, poverty, a million pensioners taken out of poverty, Sure Start, childcare, a huge social reforms, very important, very successful.
You'd never guess that from a post-political career spent giving counsel to the government of Kazakhstan or something,
Well, exactly.
would you?
That's what's so strange. If he had behaved like Jimmy Carter and gone off and done good works and not made squillions of money and lived a sort of jet-set world with highly unsuitable people, if he had given himself to the sorts of things that he did best, and emphasised that part of his time in power, I think he would be seen differently now. And mostly, people really care about their legacy. He seems to have squandered it.
I'm going to really disappoint you here. Polly's right. A lot of these things, I mean, when texts turn up from Tony Blair to Rebecca Brooks saying, you know, kind of good luck and I'm right behind you, without him knowing actually the case, you do think, well, there's a kind of caste loyalty going on here between people who sort of ran things that doesn't look good to people outside. Even if the vast bulk of the money he's got, he's actually put into charities, and he has.
I don't know about the vast bulk. He's still got a huge lot left. But you're right, the relationship with the Murdochs is absolutely toxic. I mean, peculiar, weird. The stories that come out since, utterly bizarre, and he's plainly fallen out with Murdoch in a big way.
Do you think he's unhinged, as Boris says?
I think possibly. After anybody's been in power for any length of time, people do go mad. I think 8 years for an American president is about right.
I think he's actually one of the least unhinged people around. He is actually kind of hyper normal in a kind of way, and that does in a sense mean that he's a bit bonkers. But it's a bit odd to have Boris going around telling people that they're unhinged. Frankly.
I think that's enough for now. Thank you both.